Hey guys, we're back for another review. Today we're taking a look at some new vintage style Masters of the Universe figures from Super 7, and those of course would be the single carded versions of the Filmation figures. So we've got Heman, Shira, Skeletor, and HORDAK. My Heman here has seen better days. He arrived with his power harness up around his head, so he doesn't look the greatest in the package, but thankfully we are pulling this guy out. The big draw for these figures, outside of the fact that they are of course new 5.5-inch figures, is that they come on this beautiful card back. So we are seeing them on card backs that mimic the original line of toys. So you can see him in there in the bubble. We've got him on the classic lava burst style packaging. There is a backer card in there we're gonna have to take a look at. And then the backs of these all have cross-sell. They've got action feature instructions as well as brand new artwork. So we got Heman, and then you can take a look. We see Shira, and we've got Skeletor, and we've got HORDAK. And this packaging is just fantastic. I am really happy with how the packaging turned out. I think it looks great, especially if you're an on-card collector, unless of course your He-Man looks like this. But they do look fantastic. They've got that as seen on TV burst on there, so they do have a slight change, but this is great throwback packaging. It's really hard to pull these guys out, but we gotta do it. So let's pull them out and take a look. All right guys, here we go. Our Filmation vintage mashup style 5.5-inch figures from Super 7. We've got Heman, Shira, Skeletor, and HORDAK here, and I can tell you right off the bat, I've already got some likes and I've got some dislikes, but I'm just really excited to finally get these in hand and out of the package, because I've had the Epic Battles packs for so long and I've wanted to play around with them to see how they function, and I just couldn't bring myself to open them, so we finally have them here. I'm going to move a few of these aside and we're going to run through Articulation real quick, because they're all the same in terms of what joints they do have. We'll see how they move, and then we'll take a look at them individually as far as sculpt and paint and all that good stuff. I suppose the obvious choice would be to use Heman as our test subject. It's his toy line after all. These guys are of course 5.5-inch vintage style action figures, of course done up in that MOTU style. They are not exactly the same in terms of joint structure. They're very similar in terms of points of articulation, but there's just some differences here. So we have got a rotating head. We've got swiveling arms. There's no other articulation on the arms outside of that. They all have waist twist action features, so you can swivel them like that and they'll do the kind of power punch move that was very common in the 80s, especially in the MOTU line. They've got swiveling legs, and then all of the legs have hinges. So you've got hinges that go outwards. I will say this is where I have my issues with these, because every single figure, Skeletor is the best one. Every single figure has issues with these leg joints. I am so very concerned that we are going to see legs snapping off of these pegs. It's incredibly tight. The plastic seems slightly brittle. Rotation is fine. They swivel around perfectly. And what's weird is that the right leg, so your left, their right legs are the ones that are all the weird ones. Every single figure, all four of these have odd legs when it comes to the right. They're tighter than the left. And the actual hinges, like this one, does not even want to move at all. This one will move a little, and frankly it's kind of odd that they would even include it, because you can't really do a great deal with it. They're kind of meant to stand just flat-footed like that. Shira in particular, which we'll talk about, is posed in a certain way, so she has to stand in a very specific manner, or manners. You can pose her a little different ways. So articulation is very vintage-y, but it's slightly updated. I'm just not too sure that the QC is there. I think that maybe some of the issues we saw with the first run are going to crop up here as well. All right, now as far as the look and feel of these figures, I've got some kind of mixed feelings in terms of He-Man in particular, but I do think that this line really captures what they're going for, a vintage style of figure that kind of has an overlay, if you will, of Filmation features, colors, styles. He-Man is kind of the odd man out for me, because he, as you know, isn't too terribly different from vintage figure to Filmation. Sure, there are some color changes. We've got the orange bracers, for example. You know, that's a change. But in general, I think that for the most part, this guy just really looks like a vintage figure. I don't really get a lot of Filmation vibes out of him. The head sculpt is obviously different. I think the hair is a little leaning towards Filmation. But in general, I just think he's a little too vintagey and doesn't have a lot of Filmation accents that they really could even apply. Because again, it's a similar design. It's just different aesthetics. That said, I still think it's a fun figure, and I do like the sculpt on the body really, really well. If you saw my packaging shot, and I did mention it, that the power harness on the figure had popped open in the packaging. This is removable. You can just peg it back in. So there's a 3-point peg here. Pull the straps down, peg it in. It's very vintagey, so that's nothing too crazy. I dig the armor. It looks really nicely done. It's kind of got a good Filmation aesthetic. It's just, you know, two solid colors. Now, as far as accessories go for this guy, he has his power sword with a vintage style, you know, kind of handle on it. We've got a shield here with the two tones for gray and red. He's got an open left palm, so you just slide the shield in there and then you clip it to his wrist. And then in typical vintage style figure fashion, we do have a half sword. So He-Man has the male side and Skeletor will have the female side for the pegs. But I do like this figure. I think he's probably my least favorite just because he doesn't look as Filmation as some of the other figures. But in terms of sculpt, I think it's very, very vintagey. I just don't think a lot of the Filmation stuff comes through for me personally. Next up, we'll take a look at Shira, and this is definitely one that leans a little more towards the Filmation for me, mostly just because of the outfit. Obviously, the outfit from the cartoon to the toy line was wildly different, so there's a night and day change there. I do think that this one in general looks really nice for what they're going for with the mashup of vintage style figure with Filmation aesthetics. This figure is obviously different in terms of, you know, scale and scope because she is not the same body type at all. There's nothing similar between the other figures and Shira. She's very different. She's very slender. She has what I mentioned previously. She has a pose too. So she's kind of meant to be put with her right foot slightly forward, and I don't like that. I've said this in other reviews for other toy lines. I just, in some instances, I don't really like that because it honestly makes her look kind of weird. It makes her kind of slope over to the side, and it's just not pleasing to me to look at. In addition to that, this figure is basically frozen at the leg joints here. They can't move past this, and this is a rubbery skirt, so it has a little pliability, so you should be able to move her legs out a little bit more, but those joints just don't want to move. So again, there's some oddness going on there. Outside of that, I do think that this is a very, very good example of this particular design or style or the mashup that they're going for here. She very much looks like what I think we could have gotten in the 80s if they were going for a true Filmation look. Obviously, with the toy line and the cartoon being developed simultaneously, things changed down the road, so we got two wildly different things. But if they were going for the exact same thing, I'm not sure that we wouldn't have gotten something similar to this, except for the fact that she has a soft goods cape. I'm not sure that we would have gotten that, but that's fantastic. I really, really like her head of hair. I think that it looks great. It very much looks classics to me. It looks like Motu Classics hair or the Club Grayskull hair. I think it looks really, really good. Face is nicely painted. It just, again, kind of screams that style with a marrying of the Filmation looks. And I think the paint job on her tunic is really nicely done. A lot of nice metallic gold there. And in general, I just think she looks good. My only real gripe with her is in the legs. I don't really like the fact that she kind of stands this weird way. Now, as far as accessories goes, she's got her Sword of Protection. So we got that. It's got the jewel on there. That's the only paint detail on it. And then we've got her shield with the jewel on there as well. She has a clip on here, and she has this really weird wrist. I'm not sure if this is a reference to the vintage figure or not, because I don't have, nor have I ever had any vintage Shira toys. So someone let me know. But her hand is really goofy looking. Like, that's odd, right? I don't know. She's like doing like the walk like an Egyptian dance or something. But that's kind of weird. It's not a big deal because you just clip the shield on over top. And then it's basically just, you know, she's done. But that's just kind of an oddball thing. And then we do have another sword as well. We have got a Sword of Protection without the gem. So you've got a couple options here. This is going to be my configuration, though. I think she looks pretty good this way. Very, very Filmation-y. All right, next up we've got HORDAK, and this is the one that I thought was going to be my favorite just because I love HORDAK. He's generally my preference over Skeletor in a number of ways, but Skeletor's edged him out a bit, and that's not to say this is a bad figure because this is still a pretty solid figure, and I think this is another instance, kind of like Shira, where they were able to marry the designs a little bit better, and a lot of that comes down to the fact that unlike He-Man, HORDAK's toy and cartoon appearances are wildly different. So while He-Man looks almost identical to his vintage toy, except for, minor details here and there, the idea is still the same. But between the vintage toy and the Filmation show, HORDAK is very different. He is not necessarily the same guy at all. He's obviously the same guy, but he does not look this way. He's blue versus black, things like that. Of course, the arm cannon, we've got that there as an accessory. And in general, I just think he looks like a pretty solid figure. I think this is very much a vintage-esque figure with the Filmation accents kind of thrown over top of it. So he still retains a lot of that vintage HORDAK look and feel, but then he's got the overlay of the bright blue jumpsuit from the show, the white head, the blue mohawk, those red eyes, and everything about the paint detail on this guy I think is pretty solid, and in general I just like the look of him. I think he looks pretty sweet. It's a nice idea to have a vintage style HORDAK figure in this style because this was my HORDAK. When I was a kid, when it came to HORDAK, the cartoon always won out for me. We do, for accessories, have a Horde crossbow, clips onto his left wrist. It's just done up in red plastic. Kind of matches the color of his eyes a little bit. It's pretty close. And then for his other accessory, we've got this removable arm cannon. It's pretty light on detail, has no paint whatsoever, and it just clips on over top of his wrist here. It's kind of an odd fit. You kind of got to get it just right. As you can see, there we go. There we go. So it just sits over there. You can still kind of see his hand poking out from the bottom. But that kind of seems like something that might happen in the vintage days as well. But there you go. You've got the option of having both Filmation and vintage style, or vintage or Filmation weaponry. So you got a bunch of different choices with this guy. And I do think he very much looks the part. And this is another good example of kind of what was being done here. And lastly, here is our Skeletor figure, and this is the one that I just ended up liking the most. This one very much looks like kind of what I would expect we'd get to see if a vintage figure had the Filmation aesthetic. So he's very similar to a standard vintage style Skeletor figure. We just have, again, the Filmation accents overlaid on top of him. So we've got the purple armor here, we've got the bright blue skin tone, and we've got a yellow skull face, which looks really good. It's very much a striking feature when it comes to this figure. There's really not a lot to say outside of that. Blue figure, purple armor, yellow skull face, and he's just nicely sculpted. He looks like he jumped out of the 80s, but he has the cartoon look and feel. So that's really all I needed, and Super7 delivered on this one. I do think that, if memory serves correctly, a lot of people had problems with Skeletor in the Epic Battles 2-packs, those that opened them. I don't have any issues with him so far, outside of, as I've mentioned, a very stuck right leg. But other than that, his joints are fine, he stands correctly, he looks fine, his action feature works normally, so I don't have any problems there. So maybe, just maybe, that issue was taken care of. Again, I can't say for sure because I didn't open those 2-packs, but this guy is a good example of the fact that the figure does what is advertised. Now, as far as accessories goes, we have got his power sword, the purple sword. You can put it in either hand, but of course he does hold it kind of weird if you put it in his left because he's got an open style palm, basically like what He-Man has for his shield. He does have a half sword as well, so the same thing, just clip it onto He-Man's if you want. But what's really cool is we have got a Filmation style Havoc staff for a vintage style figure, and the ram skull on this thing just looks absolutely stellar. It is perfect. It looks very cartoony. I will go so far as to say that the ram skull on this staff is better than what's on the Club Gray Skull figure staff. I think that this just looks better. It's got more sculpted detail on it. It's just solid. And then we've got a pink actual staff, which is amazing. There's nothing to not like about this figure. I think he's fantastic. I think he looks great. He's what I've always wanted when it comes to this style in this kind of size, this articulation scheme. So this one is definitely a winner. Now, one thing that I mentioned when we were looking at packaging real quick is that these guys have backer cards. So I figured we'll take a look at them. So this is He-Man's here. You can see we've got some very Filmation style artwork here. nicely drawn, just beautiful artwork. I mean, you can't not love this stuff. But what's cool is that the back side of it actually gives you kind of a progression of what we got as far as the vintage figure to, you know, an amalgamation of the vintage and Filmation. And then, of course, we see Filmation here. And it gives you a little backstory of He-Man, a little backstory of his first appearance, how things came to be from toy to the show, which I think is really cool. And you can kind of see that, you know, this is very, very similar to what we actually got in terms of this figure from this line. So He-Man is kind of the odd man out. He's very similar in cartoon to vintage. It's just those finer details that I think from the Filmation side are lost when translated to this particular figure. We've got Shira's. So this is some classic Shira artwork for sure. Of course, it says Masters of the Universe here and not Princess of Power, which I do think is kind of odd, but I'm certainly not upset about that either. And then the backside gives us that same kind of from toy to tune aspect of this is what she looked like in the toy line. This is kind of a marriage of both, and that's what she looks like in the Filmation look and feel. And it kind of gives you an explanation of the fact that, you know, the toy line was too complex to be animated, so they ultimately had to kind of change things up to change this into this for the show. And all things considered, I love the Filmation appearance more so than the toy every day of the week. We've got a HORDAK here, another one that looks fantastic. Very, 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 very Filmation looking here. That's his, you know, classic signature pose. Got him standing in the fright zone, and then the backside also gives you that same kind of toy to tune thing. Shows you what he looks like as far as an amalgamation of both, what they look like, what's similar, what's different. Because obviously this is very different from this, but this is a weird combination as well. So it's cool to actually get to see this kind of stuff and see what they were looking at for source material when they decided to kind of go down this road. And then lastly, we have got Skeletor standing in front of Snake Mountain. Again, classic style artwork. And you can see that this is another figure where he's not too different, so this isn't too crazy from what we got. So we've got the original Skeletor figure there, and we've got Filmation Skeletor here, and you can just see that they've tweaked things ever so slightly to make them look just Filmation-y and give you exactly what we saw, a very saturated blue suit, a more royally purple kind of color, and a straight yellow bone face, which, you know, I'm not going to complain about. So I think these are really cool. I like the idea of having this kind of stuff. It kind of sweetens the deal, and they make for little cool display pieces alongside your figure as well. So overall, I am pretty happy with these figures. He-Man is, like I've said, my least favorite. Not because he's a bad figure, I just don't think he's a great example of what Filmation to vintage style kind of transformation looks like. He's very, very similar in terms of his design, and I think this figure just looks a lot like a vintage He-Man figure with some obvious changes. The other figures are definitely very Filmation-y in a vintage style, and I'm really, really satisfied with them. I'm glad we got action features. It's fun, even though I'm probably never really going to use them. It's fun. It's very true to form. Packaging is absolutely stellar. The backer cards were a great idea. Love the inclusion of that artwork. Love the inclusion of the from toy to tune kind of write-ups and the history lesson that they provided. That kind of stuff is great. It really sweetens the pot. Everything about the presentation on these is really well done. The only big negative, true negative, is that there is definitely something weird going on with the legs on these figures. All of them have the same kind of odd tightness in those joints. It's not a big deal. I haven't had any breakages, and they all stand up just fine. It's just odd, to say the least. But otherwise, I am pretty happy with them, and I do think they're pretty cool. So that's going to do it for this look at the Super 7 Vintage Filmation Masters of the Universe figures. Let me know what you guys think. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share, and until next time.